Welcome to our learning series for HIPAA. We have Sarah from ProService who's going to be going over very well and robust HIPAA training for our team. So I'll be monitoring the chat in case you do have questions. If you do, also please just do the hand motion. We can stop and Sarah can answer those questions. But I'll turn the time over to you.
Thank you. And hello, everyone, whether you are virtual or in person, quick introduction to me. So yeah, we're going to be covering HIPAA compliance. My name's Sarah. I've been with ProService for just over a year. My 1-year anniversary with them was last week, actually. Before that, I've been in facilitation and curriculum writing for about 6 years now. I have about 10 years of leadership experience and a little bit of actual hands-on HIPAA experience. I only worked one place where you had to comply with it. And I know how it feels to be in your seat and go, really? Another one? So I'm going to try to make this as painless as possible because I know I was the person sitting in the back of the room being like, but just to get a sense of what we're going to cover today, yes, we're going to cover HIPAA. We're going to cover what is protected health information. We're also going to cover a little bit about substance abuse laws, things like that, as they go hand in hand, and we'll just talk about what happens to if there is improper disclosure as well. If you have a question, just ask it. If you're virtual, you can throw it in the chat or raise your hand. If you're in person, feel free to just ask it anytime it's a good time. So right off the bat, I always like to get to the why does this matter? And so I pulled some examples from the news, specifically locally, right, where we saw HIPAA breaches or issues come out. Right. In 2009, there was an issue where someone just accessed their, like not their patient, but a patient in their hospital records who it was their sister-in-law. And so they started telling it to other people in the family what they found, right? Which also feels like a small thing, but then they even went so far as to post in a public forum like MySpace. Very 2009. But when people had even less understanding of what goes on the internet, and actually ended up becoming a felony charge. She was never allowed to work anywhere that had to comply with HIPAA regulations ever again, and she served a 1-year prison sentence. Oh my goodness! And it starts with just talking about it with your family. Then, I mean, I think many of us know. Of course, don't put it on the internet, right. But even just talking about it within the family, that's what led to someone finding out about it. It wasn't even the MySpace post that got the attention. So my family was like, why is this being shared? If you're sharing about this, you're going to share about my stuff, right? And that's just one person. Of course, there's bigger things too. We saw in 2020, a whole hospital had an employee who was snooping around in the records for 5 years total. Employees fired, obviously. But there's a good sense, right, that the data theft is a huge issue there. And we even have things like in 2022, a nursing facility had basically a huge data breach impacting most of their patients, so 20,000 patients. And the breaches for that were $100,000 to $50,000 per violation, kind of depending on how intense that violation was. So clearly that adds up really fast, right? So we're just going to talk really quickly about definitions. Right? Something that sounds like many of you are very familiar with. So HIPAA stands for Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. It's not the Privacy Act, which a lot of people mistake it for, but it's about how health information is transferred, which is where that portability word comes in. It's really about protecting patients' rights and the way the information gets shared with people, as well as people's security to have their data be as private as possible and to get written consent, things like that. It's really there to make sure that like a deeper trust can happen between people and their providers, right? It requires us to make sure that all protected health information remains as private as possible. And when we need to share private health information, we're generally expected to get some kind of verbal or written consent. I'll go into, when do we need this versus that and things like that, but it relates to anything of the 18 personal identifiers. So the 18 identifiers of protected health information are someone's full name. Obviously, all the time we use first names, right? This is referring to someone's full name, makes it easier to identify. Their address, elements of like birth dates, things like that. Obviously, a telephone number, a fax number, an email, a URL address, IP address, when people are like sending us emails and things like that. Social security number, any account number, their license number, identity, card numbers, medical record numbers, health plan beneficiary numbers, device identifiers, their serial numbers, vehicle numbers, biometric identifiers, thinking about too, like having Face ID, thumbprints, things along those lines, full face photos, as well as any other kind of unique identifying number related to that information. So one thing we even have to be careful about is if we're posting things on social media, right, getting written consent if someone is in the background of that photo and their full face is visible, things like that. So this applies to healthcare providers, healthcare plans, healthcare clearinghouses, and any person or organization that has some kind of service related to those things, right? So Full Life is obviously included in this. Us at ProService, we're actually also included in this because we handle so much of people's health benefits and things along those lines. So we also have to uphold this. Any questions though about protected health identifiers? Happy to go back to if you want to. Okay. And I'll share with you right now this deck I'll be sharing with AJ at the end, so you can all have a online version accessible to you. That will come to you by end of today too. So if you're looking at something and say, oh, I want to go back to it or whatever, all yours, no need to panic, take a photo of it or write down anything. So I'm going to ask you to share with me, and I'm just going to hide this so it doesn't block anything. If you can just share whether you think the participant can revoke their authorization in these two scenarios. So the first scenario is you have a participant who previously authorized her healthcare provider to share her medical records with a specialist for consultation. She changed her mind, no longer wants her records shared. Can they revoke that?
Yes. I would say yes, but oh well about what it was already done.
Any other thoughts?
I'm thinking they're probably can, but I think it's not as easy as just saying it. I think there's more to it than just saying it.
In writing.
Yeah, so actually they can revoke it at any time, even after it's already been given. And it can just be verbally. So it can be as simple as, calling them back as soon as you get home and saying, actually, I changed my mind, right? Something along those lines. And any ideas of what you would do in that scenario? If you had a call from someone who just told you yes in writing and then calls you and says no.
You'd make sure that the records indicated that.
Yeah, have to follow through.
That you've, followed through and put it in their records, that they do not want their information shared.
Yep, you'd update that in the record. If you had already sent it to their provider or anything, you'd have to follow up with that provider as aggressively as possible, a phone call and an email ideally to say, hey, we've revoked it, please destroy the information we just sent over, things along those lines.
Which is the best thing to do, because then you have it basically in writing when you revoke
Yes.
with the provider.
In general, we love paper trails. Especially when they support you doing the right thing. We don't love them so much when they show the opposite. We love them a lot when they show us doing the right thing. Can a participant request a list of everyone who's accessed their medical records over the past year from your organization?
Yes.
No, it's okay. It's 50-50. I'm just curious to ask.
And know that they can always ask.
Yeah, so I'm hearing silence. So the reality is they can make their request and we would be expected to fulfill it. Anytime an organization is covered by HIPAA, we are expected to track who accesses patient and their medical records. So a lot of companies enable kind of a third-party software that will track it. So everyone's computer has their own address and it'll show, oh, Sarah Weinstein signed into this and they opened this, right? And so that if I ever wanted to see who could download it, it's easy to download. For places that have more paper files or don't have that kind of software, sometimes they'll have a sign-in thing where if you're accessing it, you have to write it down somewhere, things along these lines, just kind of systems. Because the reality is a participant can say, hey, I want a list of everyone who's ever seen my records in the last year, and you would be expected to be able to provide that. Upon request. Of course, you could have a few days, a week or so, but it would be expected to be a faster turnaround instead of just, sending the company a wide email like, hey, have you looked at this? Can you let me know? Another list, It should be a kind of official internal system of tracking who accesses people's records. And it's up to a year. So if they request it from up to 2 years ago, you can say we can provide it up to a year. That's all you have to accommodate. So in general, patients have the right to, one, look at their medical records, right? Know what's going on with them, get a copy of it, whether physical or electronic, but you're only obligated to provide at least electronic. They can request information on who's seen that, as well as maybe not just individuals, but other people who have gotten it, or organizations you've sent it to, things along those lines. They can share and request that specific information from their file not be shared with other organizations or people as well. They can say, yeah, this person can access my medical records, except this, right? They are allowed to say that. You would be expected to abide by that. It also means that we have to do our best to communicate about anything regarding protected health information in someone's medical records to keep it as confidential as possible, to keep everything on really a need-to-know basis. And in general, most things require consent. They're also allowed to request a correction. This is more on the medical side of things. People can say, like, I've looked at my medical records, this is not right. Like, I would like this to reflect this, or at least a note saying that I disagree with this, right? It doesn't mean that like a doctor's thing has to be like deleted entirely, or even your own notes have to be deleted. But at the very least, you'd want to note that they disagreed or something along those lines, right? And at any point, they can revoke authorization to individuals and whole organizations at any point. They don't even have to give notice that like they're thinking about it. And in general too, your best practice is you're expected to tell people all of their HIPAA rights, right? So this is information that should be shared with all participants so that they understand the privacy policy, their rights to revoke information, things along those lines, right? When written authorization is required is when you're involving a participant in any kind of marketing material. Also, when there's an exchange of any kind of psychotherapy notes, as well as any kind of fundraising, where their image or story is going to be used. So a common example I have is like a lot of different, like breast cancer awareness, they do a lot of marketing, they do a lot of fundraising, a lot of times they have people tell their stories to raise funds, but all of those people actually have to give written authorization that their story can be used on behalf of the organization too. In the state of Hawaii, you actually have to seek written information too, to share genetic information, information about STDs, mental health records, and any kind of social security number request. That is state specific though, so because we're in the state of Hawaii, even if you work with different state organizations or things like this, you would still have to follow these rules, even if the other state is like in California or something like that.
So do our media releases that give us the permission to do that?
Yes. So yeah, if, for example, if you have people kind of as they onboard or join or anything, sign a media release, that would count. But again, at any point they can say, hey, no more, right? Absolutely. But you would want to make sure the media release specifies that it would be used for marketing and fundraising and, every potential.
Yeah. There's boxes that they can check with things that they want to be in or not be in.
Yeah, and that's perfect. And what's nice about that is, one, it's a paper trail, and two, it lets them say exactly what they're comfortable with and not. Any questions about this written aspect of it? So when you do need patient authorization, whether verbally or in writing, you are expected to use what is legally just called like plain English. So the idea is to use as understandable of language as possible so that people who aren't familiar with medical conditions or language could still understand exactly what is being asked of them. So it should include what information is supposed to be shared or you're requesting, who exactly is going to receive it. For example, I think it's important to note too, if I'm asking to share it with another organization, I don't have to name everyone in that organization. I just have to say, sharing it with this hospital or this organization or these doctors, right? There should also be information about why that information is being shared, right? So there should be a clear, this is why we need this or why we think this person would need this, as well as an expiration date always attached to the sharing of that information. That's one that a lot of people, I think, kind of slip on sometimes, is making sure there's an expiration date for the sharing of data. That is something I want to just encourage you to have extra attention to, because it is one of the most common mistakes we see, is that there's not an expiration date attached to a request. And then of course you would need some kind of signature if it's for written consent that includes a date. Obviously, verbal consent, there's no signature involved, but in general, we at ProService try to recommend written consent as much as possible, because like we were saying earlier, a paper trail is your friend.
Mhm.
And verbal consent, you don't always need it legally, but it will always make your life easier to have some kind of paper that says, we got this request, we fulfilled it, or, we made it clear as day exactly what was going on. In general, it is always going to be helpful versus getting into some kind of he said, she said disagreement on the line.
The expiration date, is that, what's typical for like an expiration date?
That's a great question. The reality is there isn't really a typical thing because different providers will do different deadlines based on what's going on.
Mhm.
It's kind of one of those best judgment things. For example, if someone is seeing a specialist for a temporary amount of time, best practice would be to put a deadline a little bit past what that expected window is. And then when that expected window expires, if they're still seeing that temporary provider, the original provider would just re-request it, right? If it's, for example, trying to share it with a new long-term provider, sometimes that expiration date is like 5-10 years down the line, things like that, especially for more intensive care treatments, things like that. It really just has to do with thinking how long should they have access to it without being like reckless about forever access kind of thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, great question. Any other questions regarding this actually? Okay. So in general, written authorization is not, I should emphasize, legally required when communication is happening with other providers directly involved in the patient's care already, right? So for example, inside a hospital, you don't need to re-request information for doctors at the same hospital to treat the same patient, right? The permissions for data to the hospital, everyone in that hospital can treat that, right? It's when a provider is requesting information to share with an entirely different provider, right, outside of their organization, things like that. That's when we want that written authorization. No matter what, though, written consent is always helpful, right? That being said, again, if you are like internally here at Full Life sharing information about people you work with, you wouldn't need like written consent to share that because there's kind of an expectation of that's just necessary to help operate, right? You already got the request for it to be shared with the organization. So I have a scenario here, and I'm going to go through a few scenarios and ask you whether or not you can disclose in this specific instance. So the first one, you have a participant sister who's concerned about her brother who's in critical condition. And she asked the nurse on duty for an update, but her brother has stated that no one is to know his condition. In this scenario, if you were the medical provider, could you disclose? No, right? So even if someone is family, even if they can prove they're family, if someone says, I don't want anyone to know, you have to respect that. Absolutely. What about a participant who asks their friend to come in the treatment room? Can you then bring that friend in the treatment room and openly disclose things in front of that friend?
Yeah. I have requested them to be.
Yeah. So generally, yes, but there's a little bit of like best practice behind that. What more and more providers will do is if someone brings someone that they want into that room, they'll maybe say, oh, are you comfortable with them sitting at least in the beginning when I ask you some questions, and then we can bring them in for the rest. Sometimes they'll say, yeah, that's totally fine. Sometimes they'll say, nope, I want them there the whole time. That's okay. But it is best practice just to kind of add that extra layer of, are you sure? Or they can't be here, we'll still bring them in later. Things like that. Just giving them kind of like a second chance to rethink. Am I comfortable with this person hearing things of a more personal nature as I get to the initial questions that a provider might have, right?
Just to clarify, so in the scenario of having like our direct support providers and or professionals and our participants go into a medical office together, the DSP would then acknowledge like, hey, do you feel comfortable if I'm in the room with you? Are you okay if I know some, more, details about your medical records and have that conversation together, right? Okay.
Absolutely, yeah. And in general too, we'll talk about this in another scenario, but it is a different dynamic if it's someone who regularly visits, for sure. All right, so we're in a situation kind of similar where you have an older participant who can't read the bills that they're being given and they have questions, right? And so they routinely bring an aide or an adult daughter or sibling to read the bill to them. Can you disclose information to the aide and the daughter?
I think you have to have them ask for a request in their presence.
Any other cases? From the one?
I would say that to ask, is it okay if
Yeah,
this information is shared with this person?
they have to give permission to the provider.
Do they need to just give that permission once or every time they visit?
Probably every time.
I've run into it depending if they put your name down as somebody that is a trusted person that you can give information to, then it's okay. But there have been times when they're seeing different providers where you have to do it each time you go in if they want you to go in with them.
Yeah, so the general rule of thumb is if the person accompanying someone is a regular person who accompanies them, they're at most appointments, or they've been at the last several and they got permission the first time, then generally they can continue to be their help. For example, if you accommodate people into their appointments and things like that, once you've been given initial permission, you can generally help them read the bills, things like that. You shouldn't, most places won't ask you to re-sign things every single time. But again, if you are one of many providers that the hospital is seeing over and over again, you might be asked to re-sign, or they might be asked to re-sign things, acknowledging that you're an okay person to have this information. In general, too, when it comes to you sharing information with some of your participants, family members, things like that, best practice is, again, if it's the person who's already written down as the point person or someone who just starts coming to all of them and you got permission originally. You don't have to ask for it every time. Oh, and the last thing I want to emphasize too is that agreement doesn't have to be written. It can be verbalized too. Like the person can just say, hey, I'm comfortable with this person joining me. That's triggering both ways.
I've done some of those over the phone too, when they're like, can I talk to the person? And then they're like, yes, he has permission.
Yeah, and in general too, with like phone calls, you just would like, there should be some kind of like clarification or identify to make sure this person like really does know this person,
Right.
stuff like that. So like in a similar scenario, I have a participant's parent or sibling calling. I'm going to say instead of a healthcare provider, they're calling here. They're calling Full Life, and they have a question about an upcoming appointment that you're helping them with. How should you respond to that inquiry? If someone just calls, they say, hey, and it's not the normal person you interact with, but they're saying, hey, I'm a family member. I just want to, I'm going to be there this time. Can you confirm appointment deals to you?
Sorry.
It's a lot. Yeah, so
Put the participant on the phone so I can get
yeah,
at least a verbal authorization.
yeah. The first thing you're going to want to do is get the authorization from the participant. So you can say, great, can I speak with them? Or you can say, I'm going to call the participant and get their permission first, and then I'll call you back, right? There's so many reasons behind this. People pretend to be other people. Sometimes people who aren't identified as safe people to the participants can be the ones requesting information too. So we always want to make sure you get permission whenever possible. More places where written authorization is not required is when a participant is either they can't be present or they are incapacitated. And in that case, you and everyone involved in their care is expected to use best professional judgment. One, to say, there's documentation for medical reasons, or you name it, that they truly can't make decisions for themselves. And in that regard, people who are identified as people who can make those decisions are the ones who come together to do that too. You want to use professional judgment on things like, would they want this, right, based on what you know about them. Also, a good thing to sometimes consider is like cost benefit and knowing people's unique scenarios. When someone is present and they are fully conscious and capable of making decisions too, if you've obtained like formal permission in the past to do things, or you verbally gave them a chance to object to you making health service decisions with them or by their side, or things along those lines, then you wouldn't need written permission too. But again, that verbal thing is going to include being like, is there any reason you don't want them involved in this appointment, don't want them involved in your care, things like that, or do you disagree with what they're saying right now, things along those lines. All right, so different scenario, you have a police officer who is responding to a disturbance call and encounters someone that you work with who's exhibiting erratic behavior, and they would like to retrieve the records you have on that participant to better understand the emergency situation that they're dealing with. Can you release the information that that police officer is requesting from you?
Not without a written request, like a court order type thing.
No, that a quarter thing. I'm seeing a mix of expressions on this one. What are people thinking?
I think they would need to, it's like they can't come into your house without a warrant. They would need something, just on the spot. I don't think they would be able to request private healthcare information. They could ask questions about them sort of around that, I would think, but yeah, it seems like they would need something more. But
Any other thoughts? All right, I'm seeing some confused faces on this one too. It's tricky, right?
Yeah.
And so in general, you're right. If they're requesting that kind of stuff, they would need some kind of court issued warrant to retrieve all that information. That being said, if the person involved is an imminent threat to themselves or someone else, objectively, then you can release need to know
Need
information.
to know.
You would in no scenario without that warrant, for example, this is an emergency, you would in no scenario hand over a whole file, send it their way. But you could say, if they're trying to figure out, someone's screaming, they say they hear voices, you could release information about your knowledge about them being schizophrenic, for example.
Or
But-
having autism.
Or having autism or anything along those lines, right? Being sensitive to certain things, you could share things like, just be aware, if you do this, they'll react in this way, or sensitive to all the noises. You can share need to know information that is helpful for someone's immediate safety. But you in no way can expand on that beyond that without a warrant too. These scenarios are super rare, but occasionally they do happen.
Sure.
And when people release information they shouldn't, both the officer gets in trouble, actually more often the organization gets in trouble more than anything, since you're more responsible for knowing HIPAA laws. More times when written authorization is required, right? You've got that court order, you got a subpoena, or even a summons too for information, which sometimes happens when there's an ongoing legal case, so it's not even like a full warrant. Yeah, things like that. You are also allowed to share information if you suspect there's a very serious concerns around abuse, neglect, things like that, right? Just kind of mandated reporter kind of information. You're also allowed to share information as it relates to locating a suspect, a fugitive, things along those lines. That's the whole reason why sometimes dentists can give like teeth records for people without written consent, things along those lines. Or again, when you think there's criminal activity involved, but again, it's all based on need to know information, nothing else. Any questions on this scenario or in these cases where you would not need written authorization? You also don't need it. In general, and they've had a fair opportunity to object in these specific scenarios as well. But yeah, in general, like if it's needed for safety, you can pass it on. Sorry, these last three too, I want to highlight though. This one got like even more specified recently, which is basically you can also share information to authorized public health officials too, coming from the state and the federal government, to share information around disease spreading, things like that. We see that sometimes with big national outbreaks, and that information can be shared. It can also be shared without written authorization repeatedly if someone's in the middle of like a workers' comp claim or injury at work situation, and it's related directly to that injury, right? That in general though, that being said, in general, you always want to just say, is the person requesting information, do they need everything they're requesting? because sometimes people will over request and they don't actually need everything they're asking for. We even see that sometimes at ProService, like that come into workers' comp play and they're like, oh, that doctor doesn't actually need to send everything that this lawyer is asking for. The lawyer's just hoping to get more information, right? And so just being mindful of just because they say they need it, they don't actually always need it. So you can always ask questions, right? Like, can you help me understand why you need that information? If it's for this, right? You have that right to question first, and you should exercise that right just to protect everyone's safety, their data and health information, and also like to keep their trust with you, right? Now, there's also this law around confidentiality around substance use disorder and patient records. We bring this up as part of the HIPAA training just because sometimes they go hand in hand, and we've seen more and more questions come up regarding this too. And so one, this law protects any participant records related to substance use disorder. It helps address concerns about people feeling like they might be discriminated against or face prosecution if they like seek treatment or talk honestly with providers about substance abuse. And it aligns more with HIPAA, but it's actually even stricter in some ways. And so that's why I bring it to your attention here, right? So HIPAA allows single consent for all future disclosures, allows covered entities and businesses associated to redisclose to other providers, separate patient consent required for disclosure of substance abuse disorder counseling and psychotherapy notes, and also is subject to civil and criminal penalties. With the confidentiality of substance abuse disorder Act also includes that HIPAA doesn't though, is one, each disclosure includes a copy of the consent. So every single time that information gets shared with anyone, a faxed copy or digital copy is attached to those records to prove exactly that this person has the right to these, given permission to these records. It also prohibits that information from coming in any kind of legal proceeding against a patient without an actual court order. So it can't even just be like a lawyer request or a police officer request and you go, oh, I can see that that is relevant. You actually can only share it with people involved in like the justice system if it's with a formal court order in hand saying they need that. And that's really to protect, again, people's willingness to come forward and seek treatment and be honest about it. If they think it's gonna come into play for legal prosecution, people often then won't seek the treatment they need. But the big one that I think is most relevant is just that a copy of consent is attached to everything that gets sent anywhere, which is not the same with HIPAA. Generally, you just keep your copy of consent. Any questions about those differences? So I want to talk a little bit about making sure we secure private health information next. And so one is just limiting access to it, right? So it shouldn't be somewhere, actually really good question. Do you keep protected health information in an online database or physical copies or both?
Both.
Both. Okay, so physical copies, you want to make sure lock and key. And you also want to make sure only very specific people have that key, and it should only be people who absolutely need to have them. Some places use a system too where just 1 to 2 people have a key, and people who want access to it just ask for it, but that person records who's asking for that, which is really helpful to an organization. So later, if there's some kind of breach or problem, being able to back check and say, well, who's looked at it recently, right? Always make sure you're updating those passwords. It's one of like the most annoying things about like working in IT is, every few months you're told like, oh, come up with a new like 20 character password, somehow remember it. I dread it every time. It's so hard. I definitely want, but I will say it too. I took a cyber security class from people who are like expert hackers. One thing they shared is basically like over that thing, it takes even the best computer generated devices over 1 million years to just guess a 20 character password that has all those different requirements of letters, numbers, things like that. One helpful tip I've learned is if you have already a strong password and you're tired of always updating it, you can just start repeating your strong password. Like, oh, I'm just going to use the password I already used, but repeat it 4 times, right? Or repeat it 2 times. and things like that.
Oh, I see.
That is actually still just as secure as a unique 20-character password every single time. Don't tell people what the password is that you're keeping, because then it's no longer safe. But especially as computers get smarter, we might be in a scenario where we're suddenly like, come up with a 30-character password, and it's like, I'm gonna drill your skull open about it, right? So just start copying it over and over and over again. It's much easier to remember, and it's still just as secure. You also want to make sure, and this is really another annoying thing, but necessary. Anytime you step away from your computer, if your computer has any kind of access to patient data, even if it's like requires that person to open Chrome and then go to a private website, things like that, you either need to close that computer or fully log out every single time you step away, even down to just use the restroom. If someone comes to where you're working and you're not leaving your computer, that's okay. But if they come to your desk and you start to leave and go grab a snack or whatever, you do actually legally, you're supposed to log out or close it down. It can be annoying because we all hate like re-entering our passwords a million times, but it is one of those HIPAA expectations around data privacy. And we have seen some people, even locally, kind of get like, people, I should say, organizations get slapped on wrists because they've just, like local organizations have, state organizations have found, hey, they're not closing and logging out of their computers when they step away, and they have like participants or patients in the room that the computer is in, or even just other colleagues too. So it's just one of those small things that do make a difference. And any kind of computer that other people can easily see, for example, like a front room computer, things like that. Best practice is to have some kind of screen protector either on the sides, or they now make like screen tinters too, which I don't know if you've ever seen it, but they can even go over laptops and they just cover the screen. And when you're looking head on, your screen looks normal. But if you then look like this, the screen looks black.
Oh.
And so it completely prevents anyone from being able to like look over your shoulder so close even that my husband has one, and we were on an airplane. I'm sitting right next to him and I can't even see what he's working on, right? Until I'm like fully in the middle, right? So it's very secure, but when you're right in front of it, it doesn't make it seem darker or anything. They're super affordable and super helpful too, especially for any computer that's in like a more public area. Sorry, didn't mean to go over that. And the last thing I wanted to ask is, do you currently track who accesses files? I'm not here to like get you in trouble. I'm just kind of curious if you have a system yet.
Well, for a while, everything, all the papers is upstairs. I don't know what Myri tracks online, who accesses that stuff, but did you get that right? How we track who accesses our files.
It's only people who have authorized access to actually access them. So like,
Yeah.
if it's employment files and it's going to be myself, our executive director, and our office managers, anyone beyond that side. So there's like different levels of access that we have to.
Is it tracked, like who accesses it when?
I believe Microsoft would tell you that if we pull that information, but aside from that, I'm not like logging in. I've logged into the employment files, I pulled this file. But is that something that we need to do?
Yeah, so I mean, you should be fine for the digital ones, but I'm thinking for the physical ones, you'll want some kind of tracking system so that anyone who's up there is at least supposed to either get permission from someone else to record someone in there, or if everyone has the key, there should be some kind of, even at least like some kind of sign-in sheet or email they send or something that just says, I went in here, I grabbed this file.
Yeah,
Right.
we don't have that at this point.
Yeah.
I was the only one with keys for the upstairs files, but we have, I think I gave the other PCs, the people that are upstairs that need to access those. I left them on my desk. I'm like, you can just grab them, but then I just pass them out to the four of us that are upstairs so they can access them because they need them and I'm not here. They can just go ahead and get them, but we don't have a sign in, sign out.
Yeah, I would recommend it. I mean, it's super easy. You can make it just printing a spreadsheet. And the reality is, will you need it? Almost likely not.
Right.
But it's really bad when a court says, hey, someone said they wanted this and you couldn't provide it. We are now demanding you provide it. And you go,
Right.
sorry. And also just attach it. If it's a physical one, just attach a pen to it.
Just leave it right there.
Small things.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it can even just be something as simple as if they access it, they just shoot you an email and you just have like an email folder that just says, you don't even have to read the email, you just go drag and drop,
Yep.
yeah. You can even like search an email inbox for the word like access or file and just like group them into that. But some kind of system is going to be necessary if some issue comes up. Just a heads up. When it comes to sharing private health information, do your best to talk in a quieter voice too. When we're using names, we only use first names with people, even if we don't think we can be overheard. Of course, if we're speaking to one another and there is no possibility that a participant is near, of course, we can use last names, middle names, things along those lines. But in any other kind of space, first names only. Make sure too that in general, you should have some kind of sign that prohibits taking photos in waiting room areas. So even like that. We see these more and more in hospitals that are like getting very cautious about this, but this is actually now one of the expectations. If you're an organization that it houses any kind of protected health information and you have to follow HIPAA, you should have a general notice telling anyone who enters your building that they can't take photos in the waiting area or post them to social media or anything like that, because you're responsible for if information of participant spaces gets put on other people's social media, for example. And you know, it feels like, I shouldn't be responsible. I didn't know they were going to take a photo. If you even just have a simple poster, that's your way of saying they knew better. You know, not our fault.
Right.
We did right. And it should be somewhere obvious, as well as any kind of, there should generally be some kind of notice too, in like a main area, like the waiting room, front room, something like that, that also just tells people they have a right to privacy, things along those lines, and basic things that they're protected from HIPAA, and who they can talk to if they can have concerns. That should also be in kind of a main room for anything like this. And then in general, only disclose things that are necessary if it's not in a private area. So, you know, as someone leaves, just be mindful about the fact that, like, am I saying anything related to private health information, about appointments, or the protected identifiers, things along those lines. I'm going to talk a little bit too about what happens if the mistake gets made and data gets out, whether it's on a personal level or kind of a whole organization level, just because it's pretty important information. So there's a breach notification rule, which really says the first thing you have to do is identify what happened, how did the information get breached, who did it go to, and just that it happened in the first place. Then you're supposed to notify the person who's affected without what they call an unreasonable delay. Legislators love to use the word like reasonable and unreasonable because it's really subjective and provides like a lot of gray area. But essentially the idea is that like you should not stall contacting them. They are expected to be contacted ASAP, unless of course there is an absolute emergency pulling you away from that moment. Then your job is to notify Health and Human Services, and if the data impacts more than 500 people, you're actually legally required to call news stations and inform the media that the data breach happened. That's just so that they say, you know, over 500 people, you don't want to wait a long time for those notices to get out. It especially impacts enough people that the news should report on it so that people can find out in the news, which no one likes to be in that scenario. So I'm going to have another scenario for you to work through here. In this one, you have a healthcare provider who accidentally faxes a participant's medical records to the wrong fax number. Off a number, totally an accident. What immediate steps need to happen?
Wow. Immediately call whoever he faxed it to and ask that it be destroyed.
Okay. We have one step.
Probably contact the participant, I would think, and say, we accidentally did this.
Oops.
We're trying to fix it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which one would you do first? You have two things here. Which one would you do first?
I would call who I faxed it to first and see if I could get them either to stop the fax or at least to destroy everything.
And how would you know the call if you accidentally put in the wrong number?
Maybe if it's a fax and you don't know who else, you can fax that exact same number right back and say, accident, destroy.
Okay, okay.
Right, please call us at this phone number to confirm, destroy, things
Right.
like that,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, and then I would definitely call the participant afterwards.
Yeah, so, right, we don't want to delay calling a participant, but it is helpful to be able to say, this is what happened, and immediately we did reach out, we got confirmation, or we at least told them to destroy it, and things like, we'll call you back to get confirmation from them that it did happen,
Yeah.
or anything like that. What I don't want to do is send another fax saying, please destroy, call me when you see this, to confirm, and then wait for that call to come back for 30 minutes, an hour, things like that, and then call my participant. I would want-
pray that it would be a bad number.
Yeah, pray go on to the universe, right?
Yeah.
And just share. But then, basically, I give them a short chance to call me back. I'd call the participant, let them know what happened, and then follow up with them if I get confirmation that things were destroyed. Obviously, someone just calling you and say, yeah, I deleted it and shredded it is not 100% instilling confidence, but it's the best you can do in those situations. And you at least should be telling your participant, they did confirm it was destroyed, so that they can at least know, like, well, there's a chance that that person's honest, right?
Would you recommend also kind of doing like an incident report as
Yeah.
well to kind of keep track of what happened and what your resolution was and how you were able to?
Yeah, in general, right, you want to follow up with just documenting that it happened in the first place, and then exactly the steps you took. You want to notate things like, when did you reach out to them? Their response to hearing that information, any questions they have, follow what they want you to do, just things like that. Yeah, whether it's an incident report or just kind of a internal system where they're just kind of saying, hey, this is what happened for future notice. All of those things helpful, right? Documentation, generally your friend, even if it's documenting that you made a mistake, right? All right, we have another scenario where a healthcare provider's laptop containing private participant information is stolen from their car. It's password protected. That whole laptop is stolen. What actions would you be expected to take?
Contact the police department first. Contact your employer. And then I'm not sure. Contacting your insurance.
Beg for forgiveness.
Pray it gets found.
Anyone else? Would you all do the same thing? Do something different?
I guess reporting it to the authorities first. I mean, definitely contact your work as well as supervisors. Anybody that needs to know, I guess, and contacting the participant as well. Anybody that's involved with that could be affected by it.
Yeah, so yes, first things first is you're going to file that police report before you call anyone else. You're going to file that police report. The second thing is, yes, you're going to call your employer, report everything that happened, and you're going to also share specifically what participants' information was stored on like the main page. Like downloadable information that's not, you don't even have to access the internet to get to. Any participant information that's saved that way, like a folder on your home screen or anything like that, you need to relay and inform those participants. But if they just steal your laptop, there's nothing saved to your home screen or a download or anything like that, and it's all just locked behind an internet that, whoever stole it would have to know the website, know the login, blah, blah, blah. You don't have to actually report that to all your participants that, hey, this laptop was stolen, things like that. But you would want to monitor and make sure that the person's laptop who was stolen, like that's not, that information isn't being accessed in an unusual way, looking for like off hours, or if you can track the IP address and make sure it's not coming from where that person doesn't actually live, just things like that you would want to closely monitor. Or if you're able to work with IT to kind of delete that person's access to the account and have that employee create a new one, so that even if the person who stole the laptop somehow found it on the website, somehow gets the correct information, it would no longer be correct. Things like that. But yeah, in general, you don't have to report this to anyone if it's all stored on the internet, but if it's stored on a home screen or anything like that, you would, report of anyone who's involved in that. All right, really quick knowledge check. One, when is it okay to disclose private health information without participant approval?
An emergency.
Emergency.
Yeah.
Okay, final answer?
Only if, let's just say emergency, like if a police officer came in, but then you could only give out certain information.
As needed.
Yep, as needed in an emergency using your best professional judgment. Oh, sorry, go back. And the last one too, which is I think kind of like an obvious one, is internally in-house. How can you prevent unapproved access to protected health information?
By keeping things under lock and key and password protected.
Lock and key, password protected, how else?
Being aware of what you're talking about and where you're talking about it, keeping private conversations in private areas.
Anything else? Anyone else add?
I have somebody has a question.
Oh, yeah.
Online.
Go ahead.
You'd also keep it under kind of lock and key by keeping your passwords complicated.
Yep. Keep your passwords complicated, strong cybersecurity, absolutely. You also want to do things like make sure things are stored in a secure way. So like you said, you have a key, you know who exactly has the key. It's not like a easily accessible room. Shredding things when you no longer need them. Some people like shred and then like they have like the double shredders that like really scramble it up. Yeah. It's nothing by the end. Yeah. And then also again, making sure you know exactly who's accessing and when. What are the 4 parts of the breach notification rule?
You have to notify everyone.
What's number 1?
You need to identify the breach.
Yeah, identify what happened and where it went.
Yes.
And who's affected.
Okay.
Yeah.
Who, what, when?
Step 2.
What was the information that was actually breached?
That's part of identifying.
That's part of identifying. Okay.
And then what's step 2?
What's that?
Notifying. the
Notifying.
Participant.
Notify the participant. Step 3.
I would say no, depending on if the number of people whose information was breached, you would have to notify the media.
That is step 4.
That's 4. I remember that
Yeah.
I remember that one was 4.
We're gonna refresh her on this slide that
Yeah.
everyone. The 3rd step is you notify Health and Human Services Secretary.
AJ. We call AJ.
Okay, whatever step 3 was, time to do it. Yeah, so first one, identify, second one, notify people, third one, you have to notify Health and Human Services Secretary, and 4, it's only applicable if the breach impacts 500 people or more. And that's confirmed. For example, if stealing a laptop and there's not 500 people of information already downloaded to that laptop, you're okay, right? Unless you have confirmation someone accessed it anyways. All right, back to the knowledge check.
See, close.
It's okay. But sometimes I think the visual is helpful. Any questions about HIPAA, Substance Abuse Disorder and Confidentiality Act, Protected Health Information, scenarios specific to you all here, anything along those lines?